The first line in his journal was written on a piece of brown army stationery, faded by time and rain. The Americans must be lying. No nation could be this merciful to its enemies. It was July 1944. The Atlantic was calm, deceptively calm. Inside the transport ship, hundreds of German prisoners sat in silence, their uniforms stripped of rank, their pride still intact. The air reeked of salt and fear. They had been told stories, that American camps were nothing but propaganda prisons, that they'd be starved, humiliated, maybe shot. But when the hatch opened at dawn, a blinding light flooded the hold. Seagulls screamed overhead, and beyond the railings, the New York skyline shimmered like a city from another planet. Miles of buildings, neon lights, still glowing even though it was morning. The men stared, whispering, "Impossible. The Allies should be exhausted by now." One of them, Corporal Heinrich Keller, tightened his grip on the railing. He had survived Stalingrad, Normandy, and 3 years of propaganda lectures about the decadence of democracy. But nothing, no bullet, no battle, had prepared him for this moment of quiet humiliation. A young American guard handed him a cigarette. Not as a trick, not for interrogation, just because. "Welcome to the States," the guard said casually, lighting his own. For the first time since the war began, Heinrich felt something crack inside, a thin fracture running through years of certainty. That night, from behind the fence of Camp Concord, he wrote his second journal line. "They smile too easily. They feed us too well. Either they are monsters in disguise, or everything we were told was wrong." He didn't know it yet, but before the war ended, this same man, the prisoner, would risk his life to save the American camp that held him captive, and history would almost forget it. Almost. The train groaned as it cut through the American countryside, its wheels beating a slow metallic rhythm, clank, 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 like a distant heart that refused to die. Inside one of the sealed cars, 60 German prisoners sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces hollow from months of defeat. The war in Europe was collapsing, but no one dared say it out loud. They called it the surrender train, though none of them truly believed they had surrendered. To them, capture was only a pause, a humiliation before the next duty. Their commanders had told them, "America is chaos. They treat prisoners like cattle. Be ready." So they sat stiffly, waiting for the cruelty to begin. But when the door slid open at a small junction in Pennsylvania, the first thing they saw wasn't soldiers with rifles. It was a group of farmers, old men, women, even children, handing out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Some smiled shyly, offering coffee in tin cups. One of the POWs hesitated, unsure if it was some kind of mockery. The American sergeant just nodded. "Go ahead, boys. They made it for you." The bread was soft. The coffee was hot. It was human. Heinrich Keller watched one of his comrades, a boy barely 20, take a bite and start to cry quietly. Not from gratitude. No, something deeper. Confusion, shame, relief. He looked out the window and saw green fields stretching for miles, unscarred by bombs, untouched by war. "This can't be real," he whispered. An older sergeant beside him muttered, "If this is captivity, then what were we fighting for?" That night, as the train rumbled toward Camp Concord, Heinrich wrote another line in his journal. "They win without firing a shot, not with weapons, but with mercy." He didn't know it yet, but the train wasn't carrying prisoners. It was carrying witnesses, men about to confront the truth of a nation they were taught to hate. And the real shock was waiting behind the barbed wire. The ship slid through morning fog, its hull trembling under the slow churn of the Atlantic. The German prisoners crowded the deck, squinting into the pale light. At first they saw nothing, only mist and gulls. Then slowly, the skyline began to rise out of the haze. New York, it was like a mirage, towers made of glass and steel, endless lights still burning though the sun had already risen. The city pulsed with motion. Tugboats darting through the harbor, cranes swinging in the shipyards, bridges glittering like veins of metal. For men who'd been told that democracy was chaos, this was a blow to the soul. Heinrich Keller gripped the rail, his knuckles white. "It's impossible," he muttered. "They said their cities were in ruin, factories idle, people starving." Beside him, a fellow officer whispered, "Maybe it's all a show. Maybe they built this for us." But the illusion refused to break. As they passed Liberty Island, an American sailor shouted something in broken German. "That's Lady Liberty. You can wave if you want," and laughed good-naturedly. A few prisoners actually did, half joking, half ashamed, as if greeting a ghost from another world. When the ship finally docked, the men stood in stunned silence. No jeers, no beatings, just rows of soldiers unloading crates, organized, calm, efficient. One guard even handed them sandwiches, white bread, thick ham, real butter. Most hadn't tasted such food since before the war. Heinrich bit into his and froze. The softness of the bread, the sweetness of the butter, it was unbearable. Every bite tasted like defeat. That night, behind the wire fence of Camp Concord, the city lights still glowed faintly on the horizon. He couldn't sleep. "How," he wrote in his journal, "can a nation at war shine brighter than we ever did at peace?" He closed the notebook, trembling. The propaganda back home had promised him glory, but the real America, loud, messy, merciful, was beginning to unravel everything he thought he knew. And the next morning, that unraveling would continue, with a bottle of Coca-Cola and a smile he couldn't explain. The buses rolled through the pine-lined roads of Oklahoma, dust curling behind their wheels. The men inside were silent, watching, waiting for the cruelty they had been warned about. American prison camps, their officers had said, are places where pride goes to die. But when the gates of Camp Concord creaked open, what they saw instead made no sense. There were gardens, a baseball field, wooden barracks that looked cleaner than their own barracks back home. And just beyond the mess hall, a group of American soldiers were laughing. Laughing. Heinrich Keller watched as a guard tossed a ball of paper toward another man, who caught it with a grin. Music drifted from a radio, a swing tune, bright and unashamed. It was like stepping into a dream that refused to end. At lunch, each prisoner received a tray: white bread, roast beef, mashed potatoes, and something they'd only heard about in stories: a cold bottle of Coca-Cola. The glass fogged in the summer heat. The liquid fizzed like captured sunlight. A young POW stared at it, suspicious. "It's poisoned," he muttered. But an American cook just laughed, opened one for him, and took a sip first. "See? Just sugar and bubbles." When the German finally drank, the taste hit him like a wave. Sweet, foreign, alive. Around the room, the sound of bottles popping filled the air like distant fireworks. Some men smiled for the first time in years. Others looked away, ashamed of the pleasure. Heinrich sat still, his hands trembling around the bottle. "Why?" he asked the guard. "Why treat us like this?" The American shrugged. "Because the war's over, for you at least. Might as well enjoy the peace." That night Heinrich wrote, "They disarm us not with force, but with kindness. Every act of mercy feels like defeat." As he looked through the barbed wire, the mess hall lights glowed warm against the dark. Somewhere inside, the radio played softly, Bing Crosby singing "Don't Fence Me In." He closed his eyes. For the first time, he wondered which side was truly free. But the real shock would come when he learned what America could build in 4 days flat. It began with a rumor. Someone in the camp said the Americans could build an entire cargo ship in less than a week. The others laughed, nervously. That was impossible. In Germany, a single submarine took months, even with forced labor and precision tools. They exaggerate, one officer said. They always exaggerate. But a week later, a projector flickered to life in the recreation hall. The guards had invited the prisoners to watch a morale film. The reel snapped, hissed, and then there it was. Grainy black and white footage of a shipyard on the American coast. Men and women, welding steel under the blaze of sparks. The narrator's voice echoed through the hall. This is the Liberty ship, the backbone of our fleet. From keel to sea in 4 days, 5 hours and 29 minutes. The prisoners leaned forward. 4 days. A ship. An ocean-ready vessel with engines roaring, sliding down into the water before their eyes. Heinrich felt his throat tighten. He watched thousands of American workers moving like parts of one great machine. No whips, no slogans, no fear, just rhythm. Coordination, music of steel and sweat. Beside him, a Luftwaffe mechanic whispered, "We can't even repair a bomber that fast." Another muttered, "If this is true, we never had a chance." The room fell silent. The only sound was the soft ticking of the film reel, like a clock marking the death of an illusion. When the lights came back on, no one spoke. One man muttered a prayer, another folded his hands, as if mourning something invisible. Heinrich wrote that night, "We were told the enemy was weak, lazy, undisciplined. But if they can build a ship in 4 days, then maybe we were fighting the wrong war." He stared at the fence outside, its barbs catching the moonlight like sparks from a welder's torch. Somewhere beyond it, he knew, thousands more ships were already on their way across the Atlantic. And soon, he would see how those same hands built machines that flew faster than his beliefs could keep up. A week after the Liberty ship film, a group of prisoners, including Heinrich Keller, were taken on a labor transfer. They thought it was punishment. It wasn't. The truck rolled through endless fields until, in the distance, steel giants began to rise. Towers, cranes, smokestacks. A sign read, "Willow Run Ford Motor Company." The guards said little. "You're here to assist with supply work," one of them explained. But when the prisoners stepped inside the factory, words vanished. It wasn't a building. It was a city under one roof. Conveyor belts ran for miles. The air thundered with the rhythm of machinery and music, the hum of thousands of workers moving as one. Men, women, even teenagers in denim overalls, each knew exactly what to do. Rivets clanged, engines roared, wings shimmered under bright floodlights. Heinrich craned his neck, speechless. Every 63 minutes, a complete bomber rolled off the line, a gleaming B-24 Liberator, ready for the sky. He whispered to the guard, "Every hour?" The guard smiled. "Every hour on the hour." Henry Ford's way. He watched an American foreman pat a worker on the back, both laughing as sparks showered over their boots. There were no officers shouting, no flags, no fear, just momentum. Precision born not from terror, but from trust. A German engineer beside Heinrich murmured, "We used slave labor. They use pride." And for the first time, the word efficiency felt different. No longer a weapon, but a kind of freedom. At lunch, a woman offered the POWs coffee and apple pie from a tin tray. Heinrich couldn't look her in the eye. The scent of cinnamon made him ache. That night, back at Camp Concord, he wrote, "I used to believe discipline came from fear, but here it comes from purpose. Every bomber they build is a hymn to something we never understood." He closed his journal and stared at his reflection in the window. The factory lights still glowed in his memory. Endless, alive. But the next revelation wouldn't come from machines. It would come from mercy itself. The rumor started as a whisper in the camp mess hall. Someone said the Americans had built a pipe, an actual pipe, that carried fuel beneath the ocean, from England to France. Pluto, they called it, pipeline under the ocean. The German officers scoffed. Ridiculous. No one can move oil across salt water. The pressure alone would tear it apart. But the guards just smiled, said nothing. A few days later, they rolled in a projector again. The film began with waves breaking on the English coast. Men in raincoats wrestled with coils of metal tubing, miles of it. Barges slid into the gray water, unreeling steel like silver veins into the sea. The narrator's voice carried over the sound of gulls. Every drop of fuel our troops need in Europe flows unseen beneath the waves. Heinrich leaned forward, heart pounding. The camera dove underwater, shafts of light cutting through the blue as the pipeline stretched endlessly into darkness. Thousands of gallons of fuel pumped through the ocean like blood through an artery, feeding tanks, trucks, and planes across the channel. It wasn't brute force that won this war, he realized. It was imagination. The man next to him, once an engineer in Hamburg, whispered, "We built walls. They built bridges." When the lights came back on, no one spoke. One POW chuckled bitterly. Even the sea obeys them now. Heinrich stared at his hands, calloused and shaking. The enemy he'd been taught to despise had mastered something far greater than conquest. They had mastered connection. That night, his journal grew darker. "Every innovation I see makes me smaller. We fought a nation of dreamers, and we thought we could outthink them with fear." He closed the notebook and listened to the distant hum of the camp's generators. Electric power, constant, unfailing. It sounded like the heartbeat of a world he no longer understood. But the next shock wouldn't come from machines or oceans. It would come from dinner plates and kindness that felt more dangerous than any weapon. The dinner bell rang at 6. Just as the Oklahoma sun began to sink into amber haze, the smell drifted through the camp, something rich, warm, unmistakably human. For a moment, the prisoners thought it was a trick. Dinner in a POW camp usually meant boiled potatoes, maybe cabbage if they were lucky. But when the doors to the mess hall opened, they froze. Rows of long wooden tables, plates of roast beef, peas and carrots, mashed potatoes swimming in butter, warm rolls still steaming from the oven. And again those cold glass bottles of Coca-Cola, beads of condensation running down their sides like morning dew. An American cook in a white apron motioned with a grin. "Eat up, boys. You earned it." Heinrich Keller hesitated. His body remembered the hunger of the Eastern Front, but his mind recoiled. How could he eat like a man when he'd come here as a prisoner? He sat down slowly. Across the table, a guard passed him the salt. No words, no mockery, just a small act of courtesy. It was unbearable. Heinrich picked up his fork, then stopped. Back home, his mother stood in food lines. His sister wrote letters from the ruins of Dresden. And here he was, eating like a guest in the enemy's house. A young POW muttered under his breath, "They're soft. That's why we'll win when we're free again." But even he couldn't hide the pleasure when he bit into the bread. Halfway through the meal, the lights flickered on, bright, electric, effortless. In Germany, that light meant safety. Here it was just normal. Heinrich swallowed hard and stared at his reflection in the Coke bottle. "Maybe," he whispered, "this is what victory really looks like." That night, his journal read only one sentence. "They feed us like men, and it hurts worse than hunger." He closed the notebook and listened to the faint laughter from the guards outside. Ordinary men sharing stories under a sky without sirens. Tomorrow, he would discover that even laughter could be a weapon, when it came from a movie screen mocking everything he once believed in. They called it movie night. A treat, the guards said. The prisoners shuffled into the recreation hall, suspicious as always. Rows of benches faced a white bedsheet strung up like a theater screen. The air smelled of dust and cigarette smoke. Someone cranked the projector, and a single beam of light cut through the dark. The reel flickered to life. At first, the prisoners saw a familiar figure. A small man with a mustache, marching stiffly across the screen. But this wasn't a newsreel. It was the great dictator, Charlie Chaplin. Within seconds, the room split in two, half stunned silence, half uneasy laughter. On screen, Chaplin's parody of Hitler stumbled, shouted nonsense in fake German, his voice breaking into ridiculous gibberish. The Americans roared with laughter outside the hall. Inside, the German POWs sat frozen. Their Führer, the man who once commanded continents, was now a clown. Heinrich Keller watched, jaw clenched, every laugh cutting deeper than any insult. But something unexpected began to happen. The longer the film played, the more the tension cracked. One of the younger prisoners snorted involuntarily. Another chuckled when Chaplin tripped over his own boots. Soon, laughter spread like wildfire. Uncontrolled, nervous, contagious. For the first time in years, they laughed at themselves. When the film reached its final speech, the one where Chaplin looked straight into the camera, pleading for kindness, for reason, for humanity, no one made a sound. The light from the projector washed over their faces like confession. Heinrich felt tears sting his eyes. It wasn't mockery anymore. It was release. The kind of laughter that hurts because it's true. When the reel ended, no one moved. The American guard finally spoke. You see, not every war is fought with bullets. That night, Heinrich wrote, we were taught that laughter was weakness, but tonight it felt like freedom. Outside, the Oklahoma wind whispered through the pines. In the distance, the sound of the projector still clicked, like the heartbeat of a world where even comedy could break a man's chains. But the next message wouldn't come from a movie. It would come from a letter that was never allowed to leave the camp. It was Sunday morning, and the camp was quiet. The guards allowed the prisoners a few hours to write letters. For morale, they said. Sheets of thin stationery were passed around, stamped with a red eagle, and the words, examined by censor. Most men wrote the same thing every week. I am alive, I am well. The Americans treat us decently. Lies that comforted both sides. But that day, Heinrich Keller didn't write the usual script. He sat alone by the barrack window, sunlight spilling across the paper, and began a letter that no censor would ever approve. Dear Mother, he wrote, his hand trembling. I don't know how to explain what I've seen. The people we were told were monsters. They smile at us. They feed us meat, bread, even sweets. Their children wave to us through the fence. They have everything we were promised would vanish under democracy, and yet they share it. He paused, staring at the ink. Around him, men hummed quietly, some carving wooden toys, others reading English textbooks the guards had given them. The sound was peaceful, too peaceful. He continued, if what I see is true, then we have been deceived all our lives. America is not chaos. It is order without chains. Their power is not in weapons, but in the way they live. He folded the paper carefully, sealing it with a single strip of tape. When he handed it to the camp clerk for inspection, the man glanced at the words, frowned, and set it aside in a separate pile. The one marked, not to be sent. That evening, Heinrich saw the envelope burning in a metal barrel behind the office. The flame flared orange, devouring the truth he had tried to send home. He whispered to himself, even my honesty is contraband. Back in the barracks, he opened his journal and wrote only one line. If my mother never reads my words, maybe history will. He didn't know that the next morning, a miracle of mercy, penicillin, meant for American soldiers, would change his beliefs forever, and for the first time, he would see compassion wielded like a weapon stronger than war itself. The infection started small. A cut on the leg, a bit of rust from a shovel handle. No one in Barrack 12 thought much of it until the fever came. The prisoner's name was Franz, a baker from Bremen. Within 2 days, the wound turned black. He lay shivering on his cot, whispering prayers in German that even God might have stopped hearing. In the Reich, this would have been the end. A man too sick to work was a burden. But at Camp Concord, something else happened. The American doctor arrived that afternoon, a captain with sleeves rolled up, smelling faintly of disinfectant and tobacco. He examined Franz, said nothing, and left. An hour later, he returned with a small glass vial. The label read penicillin, U.S. Army Medical Supply. The guards exchanged looks. Everyone knew how rare that drug was, how even wounded GIs at the front sometimes died waiting for it. And yet, the doctor knelt beside a German prisoner and said quietly, "Hold still, buddy." He injected the serum, then stayed until nightfall, checking Franz's pulse every hour. The prisoners watched in stunned silence. Heinrich felt something twist inside him, admiration and shame, tangled so tightly he couldn't breathe. By morning, the fever broke. Franz opened his eyes, whispering, "Danke." The doctor just smiled. "You're welcome. You're still breathing, aren't you?" Heinrich stood outside the infirmary, staring at the rising sun, the smell of antiseptic still clinging to his clothes. In his journal that night, he wrote, "They save our wounded with medicine they deny their own. We chained mercy to loyalty. They made mercy their strength." Word of the injection spread through the camp like wildfire. Some prisoners refused to believe it. Others began to. And belief, Heinrich realized, was far more dangerous than any weapon. He looked through the barbed wire, past the guard towers, and whispered, "If kindness can cross this fence, maybe the war is already over." But he was wrong. The Americans had one more surprise waiting, one that didn't heal wounds. It healed minds. And it began with a classroom built behind the wire. It began quietly, with a chalkboard, a few tattered books, and a handwritten sign nailed to a wooden post. Camp Concord Education Program. The Americans called it rehabilitation. The Germans called it strange. At first, the prisoners laughed. Who would want to teach their captors language? But curiosity has a way of slipping through even the tightest fences. Within a week, the barrack was full. A young American lieutenant, barely 25, stood at the front, writing on the board in careful, looping letters. Freedom. He underlined it once, then turned to the room. "Not just a word," he said. "It's a habit." Heinrich Keller sat in the back, arms crossed. He hadn't come to learn. He came to listen, to understand why the enemy believed in such madness. Yet, as the days passed, the lessons began to unsettle him. They read Jefferson, Lincoln, even Thoreau. They spoke about the right to think, to question, to disagree. One afternoon, the lieutenant handed out newspapers. "These are from last week," he said. "Our press is free. Even the president gets criticized." The prisoners stared at the headlines. "Open dissent," printed in ink, and no one shot for it. It was unthinkable. After class, Heinrich approached the lieutenant. "Why let us read this?" The American smiled. "Because truth doesn't fear readers." That night, Heinrich couldn't sleep. He opened his journal. "We built a world of obedience. They built one of trust. They conquer without conquering." The next morning, he joined the lesson, not as a skeptic, but as a student. He stumbled through English phrases, his accent thick but determined. When the lieutenant asked for a translation of freedom, Heinrich hesitated, then said softly, "To breathe without permission." The class went silent. Outside, the wind rattled the barbed wire, whispering like applause. But America wasn't finished yet. Soon mercy would come rolling through the gates again, this time in trucks painted white, bearing a red cross and a kind of kindness no propaganda could explain. Fan 13, the Red Cross delivery, 350 Taunger 2. It was late afternoon when the sound of engines echoed down the dirt road leading to Camp Concord. The guards called for everyone to line up. The prisoners shuffled outside, squinting into the sunlight. On the horizon, a convoy of trucks appeared, white, gleaming under the Oklahoma sun, each one marked with a bold red cross. The POWs exchanged uneasy glances. supplies for the Americans. Surely, medical aid for the front lines. But as the convoy pulled through the gates, something strange happened. The trucks didn't stop at the guards' depot. They rolled straight toward the prisoners' yard. The lead driver, a woman in a khaki uniform, jumped down, waving cheerfully. "Delivery from the Red Cross," she said. "For you. For us." The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Crates were unloaded. Biscuits, chocolate, cigarettes, canned fruit, soap. Letters. Dozens of small brown envelopes marked "To German POWs, USA." Packages wrapped in paper bearing foreign stamps. Sweden, Switzerland, sometimes even Germany. Heinrich watched as a guard opened a box and handed out its contents. When it was his turn, he received a tin of butter cookies and a small red parcel tied with string. The label said, "From the Children of St. Paul's Church, Ohio." Inside was a knitted scarf. He stared at it as if it were contraband. "Why would they send this to us?" he whispered. The American chaplain nearby smiled gently. "Because forgiveness isn't rationed." Around him, hardened soldiers broke down. One kissed a bar of chocolate before eating it. Another clutched a letter to his chest, tears streaming silently down his face. Heinrich felt something collapse inside him. A quiet, painful surrender that no army could demand. That night he wrote in his journal, "They defeat us with compassion. I thought mercy was weakness, but now I see. It's the only thing that survives war." As the sun set, the Red Cross trucks rolled away, their engines fading into the distance. The prisoners stood long after, scarves around their necks, still warm from the touch of strangers. But mercy wasn't the end. Beyond kindness lay something even more terrifying: America's invisible weapons, the machines that turned belief itself into smoke. It began one sleepless night when a few prisoners gathered near the fence, huddled close to an old American radio the guards sometimes left playing in the watchtower. The static crackled through the dark, like whispers from another world. They weren't supposed to be listening, but curiosity had long since become stronger than fear. The broadcast came from London. A correspondent spoke excitedly about a new kind of shell, a fuse that thinks. The words were almost absurd. How could metal think? But then came the details. Radar-controlled artillery shells that exploded before impact, sensing aircraft above them. No guesswork, no waste, just precision, scientific, merciless precision. The men stared at one another in disbelief, a fuse that could see. Heinrich Keller's stomach tightened. He had once worked in an anti-aircraft unit. He knew what this meant. "If that's true," he whispered, "then our sky is no longer ours." One of the younger soldiers laughed nervously. "Propaganda," he said. "Americans exaggerate everything." But even he couldn't disguise the tremor in his voice. A guard on patrol passed by, smirked, and said in perfect German, "Not propaganda. We call it the proximity fuse." He tipped his hat and walked on, leaving silence behind him. The next morning, during roll call, Heinrich couldn't shake the thought. Machines that could think, weapons that didn't miss. It wasn't just power, it was control, the kind that stripped war of its chaos. That night, he wrote, "We fought with pride. They fight with precision. We dreamed of glory. They dream of perfection." He looked up from the page, watching the guard tower's searchlights sweep lazily across the camp. Technology had become light itself, cold, constant, unblinking. He wondered not for the first time if Germany had ever really stood a chance. And soon he would learn what that precision looked like in the sky, when even clouds could become weapons. It was winter when the story reached Camp Concord, passed quietly from guard to prisoner, from one soldier's memory to another's disbelief. Bastogne, December 1944. The Ardennes frozen like glass, and above it, the sky itself had turned into a weapon. An American sergeant, kind enough to share cigarettes with the prisoners, told it like a ghost story. They came in waves, he said, Messerschmitts, low and fast. But they didn't know we could see them before they saw us. He tapped the side of his helmet. Radar. We had eyes in the clouds. The German prisoners leaned in, saying nothing. He described how Allied artillery, armed with proximity fuses, filled the sky with invisible nets of fire. Shells burst midair, showering fragments with surgical accuracy. The Luftwaffe didn't even make it to their targets. Some pilots died still believing they were invisible. Heinrich Keller listened, his heart sinking with each word. He had been in the Reich's air defense once. He could picture it, the confusion, the panic, the disbelief when the heavens themselves began to explode. The sergeant paused, looked at the Germans, and said softly, "We didn't want to kill them, but we couldn't let them kill us either. That's the logic of war, isn't it?" Then he offered Heinrich the last drag of his cigarette. Heinrich took it, hand trembling. The smoke tasted bitter, metallic. "So even the sky obeys you," he muttered. The sergeant didn't reply. He didn't need to. That night, Heinrich sat on his bunk, staring through the window at the stars. They looked peaceful, distant, and terribly dishonest. He opened his journal. They no longer fight for territory. They fight for time itself, using machines that never sleep. He wondered if any of the German pilots had looked down in those final seconds and realized what he was now beginning to understand, that power built from fear crumbles before power born from purpose. He closed his notebook slowly, but America's power wasn't just in what it built. It was in what it could afford to destroy. The convoy rolled through Kansas under a sun so bright it bleached the horizon white. Heinrich Keller and a dozen other prisoners had been assigned to help clear an American supply depot. They expected scarcity, boxes half empty, equipment stripped for parts. That was the logic of every war they had known. Hunger, salvage, ration. But when the truck stopped and the guards opened the gates, Heinrich froze. Before him stretched an ocean of plenty, warehouses the size of cathedrals, rows of jeeps, engines untouched, pyramids of fuel drums glinting under the light, crates of canned food stacked to the rafters, mountains of uniforms, boots, spare tires, enough to clothe and feed an army 10 times larger than the one guarding them. And at the center of it all, a bulldozer, pushing it into a pit. They were burning it. The smell hit first. Rubber, oil, sugar, meat. Flames devouring supplies worth more than any German city could dream of. The guard captain lit a cigarette, watching indifferently. "Too much trouble to ship it back," he said. "Easier to torch it." The prisoners stared, speechless. One whispered, "We starved for bread," and they burn butter. Another muttered, "This is what victory looks like." Heinrich couldn't look away. It wasn't waste. It was confidence. A terrifying kind of strength that didn't need to hoard anything. They had won so completely that they could afford to destroy abundance. A tin of peaches rolled from the pile, bursting open in the dirt, syrup spilling like blood. Heinrich knelt, picked it up, and stared at the gold label. The words, "Made in California," shimmered in the heat. That night he wrote, "We built an empire to escape hunger." They built one where hunger cannot exist, and then set it on fire. He looked at the stars over the camp, the same sky that burned over Bastogne, and wondered, if a nation can waste without fear, how do you ever defeat it? He didn't know it yet, but his heart was already surrendering, one belief at a time. And soon, even pride itself would fall silent. By spring, the camp had changed. The barbed wire still stood, but something invisible had dissolved. Guards and prisoners nodded to one another in the mornings. The once rigid lines between captor and captive blurred like chalk in the rain. And yet, one silence hung heavier than any order ever shouted. There was a man named Vogel, an officer from Munich, tall, polished, a model of the Reich. Every dawn since his capture, He had stood at attention beside his bunk, clicked his heels, and barked Sieg Heil toward the eastern sky. Even when others stopped, Vogel continued, his voice defiant, echoing through the barracks like the last gasp of a dying faith. Until one morning, he didn't. Heinrich Keller noticed first. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Vogel simply sat on his cot, staring at the floor. His boots remained unpolished, his posture slouched. No salute, no words, just silence. The younger prisoners waited for the ritual, the shout that once defined their mornings, but it never came. One by one, they turned away, pretending not to see. Heinrich approached him later, offering a cigarette. Vogel accepted, but his hand shook. "I used to think," he murmured, "that obedience was strength. Now I think it's fear wearing medals." Heinrich said nothing. The smoke drifted between them, thin and gray, like the ghost of everything they'd once believed. That night, Vogel tore the insignia from his collar and buried it under the barrack floor. No one stopped him. No one mocked him. It felt somehow sacred, like a funeral for the past. In his journal, Heinrich wrote, "We used to worship noise. Marches, speeches, commands. Now, the only truth that feels real is silence." Later, during roll call, the guards played the national anthem on a phonograph. The prisoners stood quietly, not in defiance, not in allegiance, but in mourning. For the first time, Heinrich didn't see enemies across the yard. He saw men, tired, ordinary, uncertain. The war was still raging somewhere far away, but here, behind the wire, something far greater had ended. And in that stillness, the first spark of peace began to take shape. In the most unlikely of places, a Christmas dinner shared between captors and the conquered. Snow had fallen the night before, a thin dusting that turned the Oklahoma pines silver under the camp lights. Christmas Eve, 1944. The guards hung a string of bulbs across the mess hall, their glow soft and imperfect, like hope trying to warm a frozen heart. The prisoners filed in quietly. On each table sat a single candle, a loaf of bread, and a pot of stew that smelled of beef and rosemary. Someone had managed to find a small record player. It played Silent Night. Heinrich Keller sat beside an American guard named Miller, the same man who once watched him like a hawk from the tower. Now Miller handed him a tin cup of coffee. "Merry Christmas," he said simply. Heinrich hesitated, then nodded. "Frohe Weihnachten." For a while they ate in silence. The war felt very far away, like a nightmare fading before morning. Then one of the younger guards brought out a harmonica and without warning began to play. The tune was shaky, earnest. A German soldier, Vogel, the officer who had once saluted every dawn, closed his eyes and began to hum along. The same melody, the same words, but from opposite sides of a war. Stille Nacht. Heilige Nacht. Soon, voices joined in, German and English, tangled in the same fragile harmony. No one led. No one followed. For a brief moment, there were no fences, no uniforms, no flags, only men trying to remember what peace sounded like. When the song ended, no one clapped. The silence that followed was too sacred for applause. Miller raised his cup. "To those who made it," he said softly, "and to those who didn't." Heinrich swallowed hard, whispering, "And to those we must never become again." That night he wrote in his journal, "They broke our chains not with force, but with fellowship. I came here a soldier. Tonight, I was just human." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the barbed wire until it vanished beneath a white, merciful silence. But not every man wanted to go back to the world that built those fences. Some would choose to stay, because freedom, they'd learned, wasn't a place. It was a way of being. Spring came quietly. The snow melted, the fields outside the camp turned green again, and the war in Europe began to die. Rumors spread faster than wind. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and the camps would soon be emptied. Home. The word tasted strange after so long. When the guards pinned the notice to the bulletin board, repatriation process to begin soon, most men cheered, but not everyone. That night, Heinrich Keller sat outside the barrack, watching fireflies drift beyond the wire. Across the yard, Vogel was polishing a wooden toy he'd carved for the chaplain's son. A few other prisoners were playing baseball with the Americans, laughing under the floodlights. "Strange, isn't it?" said Miller, the guard sitting down beside him. "You get used to people you were told to hate." Heinrich nodded slowly. "When I go back, they will ask what I learned. I don't know how to tell them that kindness is stronger than victory." The next day, one of the men, Franz, the baker whose life had been saved by penicillin, approached the camp commander with a trembling voice. "Can I stay?" he asked. "I'll work the fields, clean the barracks, anything. Just don't send me back." The commander looked at him for a long time, then sighed. "I can't promise that, but I'll remember your name." By the end of the week, more men confessed the same thing. Not defiance, not fear, just a quiet truth. They no longer knew which side of the fence felt more like home. That night, Heinrich wrote his longest journal entry yet. "I am freer here, behind barbed wire, than I ever was under the flag that promised me glory. Perhaps freedom isn't about borders or nations. Perhaps it's about how a man chooses to see another man." He closed the notebook and watched the wind move gently through the fence. It no longer looked like a prison, only lines drawn by men who'd forgotten how to see past them. But destiny wasn't finished with him yet. One act of courage, one night of fire, would make the prisoner the savior of the very camp that once caged him. It happened on a night thick with wind. April 1945. The war was ending, but danger, as always, didn't care for timing. A storm had rolled in over Oklahoma, lightning clawing at the sky. Heinrich Keller lay awake, listening to the rain hammering the barrack roof. Then came the sound that didn't belong. The crackle of flames, sharp and furious. A shout. Then another. Fire at the fuel depot. By the time Heinrich stumbled outside, the night glowed orange. Flames leapt high behind the main gate, swallowing the rows of fuel barrels stored for transport. The wind turned the fire into a living thing, snarling, hungry, unstoppable. Guards sprinted through the smoke, shouting orders, but it was chaos. Someone yelled that 2 men were trapped inside the maintenance shed. Miller, the guard Heinrich had come to know, was one of them. Without thinking, Heinrich ran toward the blaze. A guard tried to stop him. "Get back! That's an order!" But Heinrich shoved past and dove into the fire. The heat hit like a wall. He pulled his shirt over his face, eyes stinging, lungs screaming. Inside the shed, Miller was pinned beneath a fallen beam. The other guard was coughing, too weak to lift it. Heinrich gritted his teeth, braced his shoulder, and pushed. The beam shifted. Miller gasped, his face ghost white in the firelight. "Why are you doing this?" he croaked. Heinrich answered without looking up. "Because you would have done the same." They stumbled out just as a barrel exploded, the shockwave throwing them into the mud. Rain hissed against the fire, steam rising like ghosts. The guards rushed forward, pulling them clear. For a long moment, no one spoke. When dawn came, the depot was gone, blackened earth and twisted metal. But the camp still stood, and so did the man who'd saved it. The next morning, Miller brought him a clean uniform jacket and said quietly, "You're not my prisoner anymore." Heinrich didn't smile. He only looked toward the rising sun and said, "No one ever was." That night, he opened his journal for the last time. "They captured my body, but they freed my soul." Soon the gates would open. But freedom had already happened, somewhere deep inside the fence where mercy burned hotter than war ever could. The gates opened on a morning washed in pale gold. The war was over. The guards stood in quiet lines. No rifles, no orders, just faces. Human again. The trucks waited to take the prisoners home, engines humming softly like a heartbeat reluctant to continue. Heinrich Keller stood near the entrance, his duffel bag light, some clothes, a Bible, and a small brown notebook tied with string. The notebook was worn thin, the edges darkened by sweat and smoke. Inside, it was everything the war hadn't managed to burn. Miller walked up, hands in his pockets. "You sure you're ready to go?" he asked. Heinrich looked past him, toward the horizon where the road disappeared into the mist. "Ready?" He smiled faintly. "I don't think anyone walks away from a war ready." They shook hands, awkwardly, like two men unsure which of them was saying goodbye first. Miller pressed something into his palm, a photograph. The Christmas dinner captured by a camp clerk. Prisoners and guards sitting side by side, smiling under the string of bulbs. "Just so you remember," Miller said. Heinrich nodded. "I already do." As the truck rumbled away, he opened his journal one last time. The words came slowly, steady as breath. "They took us from a broken empire and showed us a world that did not need conquest to feel strong. They fought with science, with steel, but also with something far more dangerous, decency. I came here believing war revealed the best in men. It revealed instead the truth. Kindness is the only victory that lasts." He looked back at Camp Concord shrinking in the distance. The fence now just thin silver lines catching the sunlight. A place that once meant captivity now shimmered like a memory of grace. He closed the journal and whispered, "They captured my body, but they freed my mind." Years later, that notebook would be found in an attic in Hamburg, tucked between two photographs, one of a young German soldier, the other of a smiling American guard with his arm around him. No historian would call it a grand story. No medals, no battles, no speeches. Just a man who crossed a line that no map could draw. And somewhere in that quiet space between enemy and friend, the war truly ended. They came as soldiers. They left as witnesses. If this story changes the way you see history, share it with someone who still remembers, because peace isn't what happens after the fighting stops. It's what begins when we finally choose to understand.